Innate behavior is fixed and you are born with the ability to do it. And learned behavior is something that comes about through interacting with your environment. And it's not always easy to figure out which behaviors are innate and which behaviors are learned, or what combination of the two. Sometimes a behavior has a genetic or innate component, but the behavior is modified by experience with the environment. And the best way to get an idea or to quantify how much of a behavior is innate or genetic and how much is due to environmental experience, or sometimes this is called like nature versus nurture, right? Is cross fostering studies. So taking an organism from its biological mother and putting it in the care of a mother from another species or another group and seeing what changes about the behavior. For example, California mice tend to be fairly aggressive and they tend to provide a high level of parental care, whereas white-footed mice are less aggressive and engage in less parental care. And how much of that is just written in their genes and they're born with those behaviors, and how much of it is because of the way that they were raised. Well, California mice that were fostered by white-footed mice tend to show reduced aggression toward intruders as compared to other California mice, also reduced paternal behavior, although aggression in neutral situations, they showed no difference. And then if you took white-footed mice and had them fostered by California mice, they showed increased aggression in neutral situations, although no difference from other white-footed mice in aggression toward an intruder or paternal behavior. So some level of this environment is learned from their parent, and some of it is genetic. This is more difficult to study in humans because we can't just take babies from one person and give them to another person, but there are occasionally situations that provide natural experiments, and we call these twin studies. So these are examples where you have twins that ended up being raised in different homes. So they're genetically identical, but they were raised under different environments. Twin studies have been very, very useful in establishing a genetic component for things like schizophrenia and alcoholism. A lot of behaviors are learned. They are modification of existing behaviors based on specific experiences, and there are different types of learning. One of the simplest examples is imprinting. This is a case where you have a sensitive period right after you're born when whatever face you see essentially imprints upon you as parent, right? And there are a set of behaviors that are associated with the way that you act toward a parent, but this is learning because you don't know, what parent looks like until you are born. And so imprinting is a very simple form of learning. Baby geese do this. And Konrad Lorenz, who was one of the other fathers of ethology, showed this because he spent some time with baby geese right after they were born, and they imprinted on him as the parent. And so there are lots of great pictures of him walking with little geese in tow. Because they saw his face and his body when they were first born, Konrad Lorenz is now mama. Now, there is a genetic component to this, right? There are genes that code for the process of imprinting. They give you the ability to learn. But again, you don't know what the face is going to look like. You have to learn that once you're born, and so it's a type of learning. Some conservation biologists have taken advantage of this ability to learn because whooping cranes, which have become endangered, have lost a lot of the places that they stop at along their great migration. And they learn this migration from their parents. They'll stop generation after generation at the same ponds, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of that habitat's been lost as land has been developed. And so conservation biologists dressed up all in white with white kind of very simple planes will fly them to a different pond when they know that is safe, that's on conserved land or whatever. And these young cranes will then learn that as the place to stop on their big migration, and then hopefully will teach that to their offspring. Another aspect of learning is spatial learning. And this is using the spatial structure of your environment to locate your position in space, for instance. And Tinbergen, again, showed how digger wasps use this. He wanted to know how they find their nest after they go forage and then come back to their nest afterwards. And he suspected that they used landmarks. And he set up to experiment with this hypothesis. To test it, he set up a ring of pine cones around a digger wasp nest, with lots of replicates, obviously. And he would let them come and go until they got used to it. And then they left, and he moved the ring of pine cones nearby the nest, but not around the nest. And the prediction was, if they use landmarks as he suspected, then they would return to the middle of the ring to find the nest. And that's exactly what he found. They didn't return to the nest hole, they returned to the middle of the rings that had been moved. So they use landmarks for spatial learning. They learn their environment, and it helps them. In some animals, they form a cognitive map in their nervous systems of spatial relationships between objects. And one example of this are Clark's nutcrackers. They can find food hidden between landmarks, hidden halfway between, and that's where they store food caches. Very often we learn to associate certain things with other things. This is called associative learning. And white-footed mice, which we were talking about earlier, they avoid particular types of caterpillars that have specific colors if they've had a bad experience with a monarch butterfly caterpillar. Monarch butterflies eat something toxic, milkweed, and then when they are eaten, or when something tries to eat them, it's toxic, it's distasteful, and you spit them out. And animals will often learn to associate those colors with that organism, and they will no longer eat it. Associative learning is what you see in conditioning experiments that you may have read about in a psychology class at some point in time. And classical conditioning is a type of associative learning where you take some sort of arbitrary stimulus, you associate it with a punishment or a reward. The classic example of this, the classic example of classical conditioning, is Pavlov's dogs. He took a bunch of dogs, and every day when he would feed them, he would ring a bell just beforehand. And they salivate when they eat, right? And they began to associate the bell with feeding. And so he could just ring the bell, and even without the food, they would salivate, right? They would respond to that stimulus because it was associated with a reward. And this happens to me, right? Sometimes you associate, getting home after work with dinner, right? And so you may walk in, even if there's no dinner around, you may be salivating and ready to eat because you associate those things. Operant conditioning is similar, but you're associating a reward or punishment with something that you do, with one of your behaviors. So this is sometimes called trial and error learning. Classic example of this is if you have a rat that when it pushes a lever, it receives food. And so it starts to push that lever all the time. It learns that that lever is associated with food. That is an example of operant conditioning. Similarly, if you are a rat and you touch a lever and it shocks you, you will learn not to touch that lever. Another example is a predator that may learn to avoid a specific type of prey associated with painful experience, like we talked about earlier. Monarch butterflies are raised on toxic milkweed, and so the caterpillars are toxic, but so are the adults. And so we have a bird here who eats up a very brightly, distinctly colored monarch. It's toxic, it throws it up, it's a very unpleasant experience. It may never touch another monarch again. And that's one of the reasons they're so brightly colored. They advertise, look, you may have experienced me before. I am gross. Don't touch me, please. Learning can be very simple, like imprinting, but it can also be very, very complex. And as it gets more complex, we associate it with things like problem solving and any kind of knowing that includes awareness, reasoning, recollection, and judgment we consider cognition. And cognition is something we usually associate with, us, humans, for example, or very smart animals. But even honeybees can do some cognition. They can distinguish same from different. For example, a honeybee can be trained that if it comes through and the stimulus on this first door that they go through, so they go through an entrance, but then they go through a stimulus entrance that has blue on it. And then when they go through that door, there's a pair of doors and they can choose one chamber or the other. And if they go through the blue door again, there's a food reward at the end. And they can learn to continuously choose that same color door, blue. And this is just associative learning, even if it's a little bit more complex associative learning. But you take that same bee that's been trained here and you show it this. And we no longer have same and different colors, right? We go through our stimulus door and it's a pattern instead. And under the pattern, that's where your food might be, although in this case there is no food. They'll see, will they go through the same or different pattern, or is there any difference between the likelihood of choosing one or the other? And they choose the pattern that's the same as the stimulus pattern. So they've generalized this same and different to go along with patterns as well as colors. This is a very simple form of cognition. Very intelligent animals can solve problems that they've never seen before. Chimpanzees have been shown to stack boxes to reach suspended food. So if you suspend food in the air that they can't get and you leave boxes around, they will think, they've never seen this before, but they'll think to put the boxes on top of one another, climb, and capture the food. Ravens have done the same thing by using their beak to pull up string to get food that's suspended from a branch. Ravens are really, really smart corvids, so ravens and crows, as are chimpanzees, obviously, because primates are very, very closely related to us. Dolphins show problem solving, all sorts of organisms. Very often behaviors are learned from parents, especially in species where there's parental care, like birds. And sometimes this learning happens in stages. For instance, white-crowned sparrows learn their songs from their parents, and usually each group of species, right, and each population has its own kind of unique song in the same way that we have regional accents in the United States. And white-crowned sparrows memorize the song of its species during an early sensitive period. They learn the song. And then later they have a second learning phase where they learn to actually sing the song, to perform it. And we're finding that a lot more animals than we realized show very, very complex social learning, the rudiments of culture. This means they learn things from one another in groups, and chimpanzees, for instance, will learn to use tools in ways that they never did before in a particular group if you bring someone from another group in to show them how to do it. Young chimpanzees can learn to crack palm nuts with stones, and they'll do it by copying older chimpanzees. Vervet monkeys respond to particular alarm calls for different predators. So they don't just have a generalized alarm call. They have alarm calls for specific predators that happen to be in their area threatening their specific group. Here's a look at a younger chimpanzee and an older chimpanzee, and you're learning how to crack your palm nut. And here's a look at your vervet monkey learning very specific, again, alarm calls for specific predators. When this information transfer becomes systematic, where there's systematic observation and teaching that influences individuals in a population, we can call this culture. And culture can alter behavior, and it can also impact fitness. And so we sometimes look at other organisms and say that they have some level of culture. These behaviors evolved just like your physical structures did, and they are subject to natural selection, just like those physical characteristics are. And in the next video, we're going to discuss in more detail how foraging behavior and reproductive behavior are subject to these natural selective pressures.